It was one of those evenings when the air felt crisp and the horizon glowed with the deep oranges and purples of the setting sun. My girlfriend and I had planned nothing more ambitious than a quiet walk along the lower trails. But as we sat on the hood of my car at the base of the mountain, something about the way the peaks stretched above us pulled at our sense of curiosity. "Let's go a bit farther this time," she said, her voice light but tinged with an adventurous edge. I hesitated, looking at the sky. The sun was already dipping low, and I wasn't sure we had enough daylight to wander too far, but her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself agreeing. The higher trail started innocently enough. The path was wide, its edges brushed with patches of dry grass that swayed gently in the breeze. Rabbits darted in and out of the underbrush, their small shapes barely visible in the fading light. A distant howl, probably a coyote, echoed faintly across the hills. It was the kind of sound that could be either eerie or comforting, depending on your mindset. I chose to find it comforting. As we walked, the incline began to steepen. My legs burned slightly from the climb, but the challenge was satisfying in its way. "Look at that," my girlfriend said, pointing ahead. A dried riverbed carved its way through the landscape, its rocky bottom scattered with the remnants of long-past waters. In its center lay a fallen tree, its roots twisted upward like skeletal fingers clutching at the sky. It was the kind of spot that begged for a photo, and she obliged, snapping a few shots while I leaned against the rough bark. It was peaceful there, almost unnaturally so. The kind of quiet that makes you lower your voice without realizing why. But as the sun dipped lower, a quiet tension began to build. The light was fading faster than I'd expected, and the trail ahead grew darker with each passing minute. Still, the novelty of the landscape kept us moving. "Just a little farther," she said, her voice softer now, as if the darkening woods demanded respect. The air shifted as we turned back toward the trail. It wasn't colder, exactly, but heavier, like the atmosphere had thickened. That's when we heard it, a rustling sound off to the left, somewhere deep in the trees. My first thought was wildlife, maybe a deer or another rabbit. "Probably nothing," I said, though my voice sounded too casual, even to me. My girlfriend paused, her head tilted, listening. "Let's head back," she said. There was no fear in her voice, just a quiet conviction that made me nod without argument. We retraced our steps, the fallen tree and dried riverbed disappearing behind us. The rabbits were gone now, and even the coyotes had fallen silent. The trail felt steeper on the way down, and the shadows that had seemed so picturesque earlier now loomed larger, deeper. Every so often we'd hear another rustle, faint but persistent, and I'd glance over my shoulder. There was nothing there, or at least that's what I told myself. It was just the woods settling in for the night. Nothing more, or so I hoped. The first time I saw the figure, I didn't think much of it. We were descending the trail, our pace brisk, but not rushed, when I happened to glance back. Far down the path, silhouetted against the dimming sky, was a person. They were standing still, their outline sharp and unbroken, like a shadow that had been cut out of the world. I told myself it was another hiker, someone who had lingered on the trail and was now making their way down, just like us. Still, something about the way they stood, rigid, almost statuesque, nagged at the edge of my thoughts. I didn't mention it to my girlfriend. She was focused on navigating the uneven ground in the growing darkness, her phone flashlight casting shaky beams ahead of us. I convinced myself it wasn't worth bringing up. Not yet. After all, we weren't alone out here. That was a good thing, right? The rational part of me clung to that thought, even as I kept glancing over my shoulder, hoping to see nothing and finding the figure still there, always at the same distance, always motionless. The next time I looked back, they were closer. My chest tightened as I realized they had covered a significant stretch of the trail without me noticing their movement. They were still too far to make out any details, but I could see their outline more clearly now. A tall figure dressed entirely in black, their face pale and blank. It wasn't the kind of blankness you associate with someone deep in thought or out of breath. It was emptier than that, as if their features had been smoothed away. This time I couldn't keep it to myself. "Someone's behind us," I said, keeping my voice even. My girlfriend turned her head sharply, her flashlight catching only shadows and the jagged edges of the trail. "Where?" she asked. I gestured back up the path, but when she looked, the figure was gone. I felt a small, irrational surge of relief. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the trickling anxiety in my chest was just that, an overreaction to the deepening dark. But then as we continued, she stopped short. "There," she whispered, her flashlight trembling slightly as she pointed it down the trail. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. The figure had reappeared, standing just on the edge of the light's reach. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but my thoughts were a jumble of questions and unease. My girlfriend grabbed my arm. "Let's go," she said, her voice low but steady. I didn't argue. We quickened our pace, the trail narrowing and growing steeper. My heart thudded in my chest, the sound loud in the quiet of the woods. Every so often I glanced back, and every time the figure was there, closer than before. What unsettled me most wasn't their presence. It was their stillness. Every time I turned, they froze, as though caught in the act of stepping forward. It felt calculated, deliberate, and it chilled me in a way I couldn't shake. By now, my earlier rationalizations felt hollow. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just another hiker. This was something else entirely. The air had grown colder, sharper. Each breath felt heavier as we quickened our pace, moving as fast as we dared over the uneven terrain. The flashlight beams from our phones swung wildly, illuminating little more than patches of dirt and jagged roots. Behind us, the sound of footsteps echoed faintly, a soft but deliberate rhythm that didn't belong to us. My girlfriend gripped my arm tighter, her face pale in the dim glow of her phone. "They're following us," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. I nodded, my throat dry. "Keep moving," I managed to say, though the words felt flimsy against the growing sense of dread that had settled in my chest. The trail was steeper here, and loose rocks shifted under our feet with every hurried step. My mind raced, cycling through useless questions. Who was this person? What did they want? Why were they here, in the middle of nowhere, at this hour? None of it made sense, and that only made the fear worse. A sudden burst of noise behind us shattered the fragile quiet, a rapid, heavy crunching of gravel and leaves. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned, my phone flashlight cutting through the dark. The figure was there, closer than ever, their blank, pale face catching the light for just a moment before they darted out of view. They were moving fast now, faster than seemed natural, their silence more terrifying than any shout or growl could have been. "Run," I said, my voice breaking, and we did. The trail was unforgiving. The steep incline pulled at our legs, and the loose gravel threatened to trip us at every step. My girlfriend stumbled once, her ankle twisting slightly, but she caught herself before falling. "Are you okay?" I asked, breathless. She nodded, but her eyes were wide, filled with a fear I'd never seen before. There was no time to stop, no time to think. The figure's footsteps had grown louder. more insistent, like a drumbeat pushing us forward. Every glance over my shoulder revealed them closer, their form sharp against the dim, scattered light. We reached the dried riverbed again, the twisted fallen tree looming like a ghost in the dark. My girlfriend hesitated for just a moment, as though considering hiding there, but I shook my head. "No," I said firmly. "We have to keep going." I grabbed her hand, pulling her forward. The trailhead wasn't far now. I could feel it. We just had to make it a little farther. The last stretch of the trail felt endless, each step an eternity, as my lungs burned and my legs screamed in protest. The footsteps behind us grew louder still, and when I risked one final glance back, my blood ran cold. The figure was sprinting now, their pale face illuminated by the faint light of our phones. They were almost upon us, their movements unnervingly fluid and fast. Adrenaline surged, overriding the exhaustion that threatened to pull me down. "The car," I said, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "We're almost there." Finally, the trail opened up into the parking lot, the faint silhouette of my car standing like a beacon in the dark. My hand trembled as I fumbled with the keys, every second stretching unbearably as the sound of approaching footsteps grew deafening. My girlfriend climbed into the car first, her breaths ragged and shallow. Just as I slid into the driver's seat and turned the ignition, the figure emerged from the trail, their dark shape cutting through the faint glow of the parking lot lights. For a split second, they stood there, motionless once more, their lifeless eyes fixed on us. And then, as the car roared to life, they took a single step forward. I didn't wait to see what came next. Gravel spat out from under the tires as we sped away, leaving the figure behind in the shrinking glow of the headlights. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white, as my girlfriend sobbed quietly beside me. Neither of us spoke. The silence in the car filled only by the sound of the engine and our ragged breaths. We had escaped, but the fear still clung to us, thick and unshakable. The road stretched ahead, dark and empty, as we drove in silence. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly they ached, but I couldn't let go. Not yet. My girlfriend sat beside me, her knees pulled up to her chest, her phone flashlight still clutched in one hand. The faint glow from the screen lit her face, pale and drawn. She hadn't spoken since we left the parking lot, and I didn't push her to. What could I even say? I didn't have answers, only questions that circled in my head like vultures. It wasn't until we hit the main road, the comforting yellow lines stretching beneath the headlights, that I allowed myself to breathe. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder and cut the engine. The silence was deafening. For a moment, neither of us moved. I finally turned to her, searching for the right words, but she beat me to it. "What was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. It wasn't a question for me. Not really. It was the kind of question you ask the universe when nothing else makes sense. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to say something reassuring, something that would make it all feel less real. But I couldn't lie to her. Not after what we'd seen. My own mind was struggling to make sense of it. That figure, the way they moved, the way they stopped, every time we looked back, it wasn't normal. It wasn't human. Or at least, it didn't feel human. Back at home, the silence followed us inside. The walls of our apartment, usually a refuge, felt too small, too close. We sat on the couch, the television on but muted, its flickering light casting restless shadows across the room. I replayed the events over and over in my mind, trying to piece together a coherent explanation. Maybe it was a prank, a sick, twisted joke played by someone who knew the trail well. But that didn't explain the way the figure moved, or the unsettling stillness of their face, and it didn't explain the suffocating feeling of wrongness that had clung to me from the moment I saw them. A few days later, I went back. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but I couldn't let it go. My girlfriend refused to come, and I didn't blame her. I promised I'd only go during the day, and that I'd stay close to the trailhead. She didn't argue, but the look on her face as I left said enough. The drive felt longer this time, the familiar curves of the mountain road now laced with unease. When I pulled into the parking lot, the air felt different. Not lighter exactly, but less charged. The sunlight filtered through the trees, dappled and golden, painting over the memory of that night. I walked a short distance up the trail, stopping at the dried riverbed with the fallen tree. It looked smaller in the daylight, less ominous. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind rustle the leaves and the distant chirping of birds. There was no sign of the figure, no footprints, no clues. The trail was empty, as if nothing had happened at all. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I left after only an hour, driving home with the windows down, the fresh air doing little to clear my head. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I came to a grim realization. I might never know what we had encountered on that trail. The not knowing was its own kind of terror, one that lingered far longer than the adrenaline of the chase. Some things don't have answers. Some moments remain open-ended, their edges frayed and raw, refusing to be neatly tied up. Even now, weeks later, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder when I'm alone in quiet places. The memory of that figure, so still yet so deliberate, refuses to fade. It stays with me, like a shadow just out of reach, reminding me that not all mysteries are meant to be solved, and not all dangers come with a warning.